It's the early 1670s. We're in The Hague, in the Dutch Republic. Jan de Baan sits down to paint his masterpiece. De Baan knows his craft well. He's even trained with the great Jacob Bakker. He knows how to meld light and shade, how to capture life with oil and brush stroke. But this subject is not life. It's death. On his palette, he mixes the deep reds of gore and flame and the ivory white of skin drained of the blood that once sustained it. On his canvas, he sketches the calamitous lines of bodies in positions they were never meant to be in. He sketches human beings torn asunder by a furious mob. Centuries from now, this work will hang in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. It won't be as famous as some of its gallery mates like Vermeer's The Little Street or The Night Watch by Rembrandt, but no one who sees it will ever forget it. Jan de Baan's painting, The Corpses of the De Witt brothers, is one of the most disturbing in history, and it leaves us with many questions. Just who were these men? What happened to them? And what's that cat doing there? To find out, we need to go back 3.5 centuries to a nation in the grip of an ideological struggle. We'll begin with the so-called Golden Age, and a man whom journalist Hugh Chisholm called one of the greatest statesmen of his age. And we'll end with the bloody violence of the Rampjaar, the disaster year, and a scene of the utmost barbarity, with torture, evisceration, and even cannibalism. Let's start with that first question. Just who were these men? These badly damaged corpses are Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary of the Holland States and the de facto ruler of the Dutch Republic for 20 years, and his elder brother and ally, Cornelis de Witt. Born into the influential de Witt family in Dordrecht in 1623 and 1625 respectively, Cornelis and Johan were set for a life of politics from the very beginning. Their uncle, Andreas de Witt, had been Grand Pensionary before the boys were even born, which should have made him one of the most powerful men in the Dutch Republic. But Andreas de Witt had been cautious with his power. He had to be. De Witt's predecessor as Grand Pensionary was Jan van Oldenbarnevelt, a member of the Republican States faction, or States Party. This put him in direct opposition to the Princes faction, the supporters of the Princes of Orange. The Princes faction believed that the Dutch Republic should be run by aristocratic stadholders, not commoner statesmen like van Oldenbarnevelt. In 1617, the conflict between statists and Oranges threatened to boil over into outright civil war in the Dutch Republic. Van Oldenbarnevelt decided to make a move. He added fuel to this potential inferno by declaring independence for the States of Holland. When Maurice, the Prince of Orange, learned of this, he flew into a rage and decided to take Holland back by force. He invaded Holland in 1618, and it was only the immediate surrender of the statist troops that prevented all-out civil war. So Maurice had achieved a bloodless coup d'etat in Holland, but it would not remain bloodless for very long. The Orangists needed a victim to make an example of. That victim was van Oldenbarnevelt, and after a swift trial, he was sentenced to death. He knelt upon a pile of sand at Binnenhof in The Hague, pulled his nightcap down over his eyes, and awaited the executioner's sword. His last words were reportedly, "Make it brief. Make it brief." And, to be fair, it was brief. His head rolled into the dirt with one stroke of the sword. But it was also a clear message. You can take the highest offices in the country, but you can't stand against the Princes of Orange. Andreas de Witt learned this lesson well when he took over as Grand Pensionary. He did so in name only. It was Maurice of Orange who gave the orders. Andreas de Witt just carried them out. Perhaps Andreas's nephew, Cornelius de Witt, would have been happy to follow in his uncle's footsteps. He became councillor and was later mayor of his hometown in Dordrecht, but he was not particularly ambitious nor particularly talented. But for Cornelius's younger brother, Johan de Witt, it was a different story. Johan had both ambition and skill. He also had a clear political vision for his country. Johan de Witt believed that the Dutch Republic's strength lay in its mercantile classes, not in its Orangist aristocracy. He was an ardent supporter of the States Party and therefore an enemy of the Princes of Orange. And unlike his uncle, he wasn't afraid to make this opposition known. De Witt set about creating the alliances that would move him closer to power. He solidified his relationships with the Bicker family and the de Graaf family and powerful clans who controlled nearby Amsterdam. But this too was dangerous. In 1650, both Andreas de Witt and Maurice of Orange were dead. Now, Maurice's nephew, Prince William II, was stadtholder, and he was in an awkward position. He'd lost the support of the Grand Pensionary in Holland, and as Holland was one of the wealthiest and most powerful of all the Dutch states, this would not do. So William decided to use force, just like his uncle had done. He invaded Holland and tried to seize Amsterdam and the de Graafs. But while his uncle Maurice had achieved a swift and bloodless victory, William's attack was an absolute mess. Many of the Orange's troops simply arrived late, and William II was not able to take the city. He was able, however, to put Amsterdam under siege, and this meant that he could negotiate a peace on terms that suited him. The de Graafs remained in power in Amsterdam, but their allies, the Bickers, were purged from the city council. While his siege had been a military failure, William's Orangists were now in a stronger position. Without the Bickers, the de Graafs were vulnerable. But this victory was short-lived, much like William II himself. By November 1650, Willie was dead from smallpox, and his son, William III, was not born until 6 days after the prince's death. In other European polities, this wouldn't have been a problem. They would have simply proclaimed William III the new stadtholder and put a regency in place until he was old enough to take office. But there was no set mechanism to make this happen in the Dutch Republic, and instead, the 7 provinces would come together and elect a new stadtholder. This meant Zeeland, Utrecht, Guelders, Friesland, Groningen, and Overijssel, getting together with Holland to decide on William II's replacement. But the states of Holland weren't in the mood to wait around. The provinces were supposedly equal, but in practice they weren't. Holland was the more powerful, and now they saw their chance. They set about taking the stadtholder's powers for themselves, and so began the first stadtholderless period of the Dutch Republic. But there were other changes afoot too. When the statist Grand Pensionary, Adrian Pauw, died in 1653, there was a vacancy in the office. Johan de Witt, with the support of Cornelius de Graaf, was the ideal choice, and so de Witt became the Grand Pensionary in Holland and de facto ruler of the Dutch Republic. De Witt immediately began solidifying his position. Wendela Bicker was one of the wealthiest commoners in the Republic. She was the daughter of former Amsterdam Mayor Jan Bicker and the niece of current Amsterdam Mayor Cornelius de Graaf. In 1655, she also became the wife of Johan de Witt. De Witt had effectively united the 3 powerful clans of Holland, and now there was no stopping him. By 1662, he was outlining his own view for the future of the Netherlands. The first item on the agenda was pretty uncontroversial. He called for, quote, peaceful foreign policy, since every war weighs on the economy. Surely, no one was going to argue with this. The Dutch Republic depended on its vast mercantile fleet and its maritime trading economy, but a series of wars against the English and the 80 Years' War against Spain made trade almost impossible, and this kind of conflict was an economic nightmare. The Dutch also had a habit of experiencing disastrous losses. Fighting the English at Gabbard Bank in June 1653, the great Admiral Martin Tromp had lost 20 of his 98 ships and almost 2,000 men. Tromp himself died the following month, felled by a musket ball from an English sharpshooter. The nation could not afford any more of these wars, and even the Orangists could agree on that. But the next two items on de Witt's agenda were a bit more controversial. He called for the greatest possible autonomy for Holland and distance from the other 6 provinces. He hoped this would ease the burden on rich Holland, something that he felt would benefit the Republic as a whole. Other provinces, understandably, were not convinced. At the Great Assembly, both Friesland and Groningen had opposed Holland, and there was still strong support for the Princes of Orange, which put de Witt in a dangerous position. Johan de Witt was well aware of this, which brings us to the third item on his agenda: permanent disempowerment of the Princes of Orange. De Witt was a merchant, and he believed that merchants drove the economy of the Dutch Republic. In his view, the dynastic ambitions of the Princes of Orange were not in the interests of the country. For de Witt's biographer, Johan Israel, de Witt genuinely believed that Europe's kings and German princes sought only dynastic advantage and territorial aggrandizement, goals which often conflicted with the interests of their subjects. It's likely that de Witt genuinely did have the interests of the Dutch Republic at heart, but now he was fully committed. He had to succeed. If not, he ran the risk of civil war and his own bloody demise. But to be fair on de Witt, it did seem like he succeeded, at least for a while. Despite all the infighting and bloodshed, the Dutch Republic had been in something of a golden age since the late 16th century. But under de Witt, they just went from strength to strength. With new colonial holdings in South Asia, the Dutch economy boomed. At home, their experiment with republicanism, known as true freedom, drew admiration from many who viewed the Dutch Republic as a new and innovative model. While it was far from egalitarian, the Dutch system of regents offered a vaguely meritocratic form of government, far more so than the monarchies of Europe and Cromwell's republic in England, at least. And this was more than a century before the revolutions in France and the United States, so it was, in a sense, ahead of its time. But while de Witt was one of the architects of this, he didn't present himself as any kind of king or president. He walked freely about the streets of The Hague with no bodyguard or personal protection. And this is quite admirable, but in essence, it's a reflection of what the office of the Grand Pensionary was supposed to be about. It was an office of the civil service. Grand Pensionaries weren't meant to be the leaders of a nation. But before we get too misty-eyed about how much of a great guy Johan de Witt was, it's important to note what was supporting the Dutch boom. As well as trading in spices and silk, the Dutch were also trading in people, just like all the other big maritime powers were. It's estimated that more than 500,000 enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic on Dutch ships between 1588 and 1672. Slavery was also practiced in the Dutch East Indies. In the 1650, around half of the inhabitants at Batavia, modern Jakarta, were enslaved people. But as this was 17th century Europe, no one really cared about this. The people who hated Johan de Witt and his brother hated him for an entirely different reason. The support for the Princes of Orange had never gone away, and de Witt had real enemies who were out for his blood. What's more, William III of Orange wasn't a newborn baby anymore. He was a young man, and he was ready to lead the country. Perhaps in this sense, walking around unguarded was a little naive. In 1670, de Witt said, "The nature of the Dutch is such that, if the need and dangers are not very clear to them, they cannot be prepared to properly safeguard their own security." As it turned out, it was de Witt himself who needed to safeguard his security most of all. Just 2 years later, everything went to hell for the de Witts. This was 1672, the rampjaar, the disaster year, when the so-called golden age of the Dutch Republic came to its end. But if this was a disaster for the Republic, it was an absolute catastrophe for the Witt brothers. The first months of 1672 were anxious. There was talk of an impending war with France and a Dutch military that was barely prepared to defend itself. But de Witt was a capable diplomat. He had allies. The Triple Alliance of England, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic would provide a united front against France. Unbeknownst to de Witt, the English were making moves behind his back. England had reverted to a monarchy from 1660 and saw the Republican Dutch as weak. For England, France seemed to be the better ally. On March the 12th, 1672, the English made their move. Admiral Robert Holmes's fleet attacked a Dutch trade convoy. The following month, France, Munster and Cologne all declared war on the Dutch Republic, and now the Republic was under siege at sea and on land. After a 10-day siege, the fortress town of Groenlo fell to the invaders. The door was now open for a complete Dutch capitulation. De Witt had always had his enemies, but now his policies were being blamed for a total Dutch collapse. The Orangists stoked this fire. They said that de Witt had made the Republic weak and left her vulnerable to attack. Days after Groenlo had fallen, a man attempted to assassinate Johan. As he was leaving a meeting, the statesman was slashed badly with a knife, but was fortunate enough to escape with his life. This obviously rattled Johan de Witt. By August 4th, his position had become untenable. He resigned as Grand Pensionary, bringing his almost 2 decades as de facto ruler of the Dutch Republic to an end. Perhaps he thought he could step away from the political spotlight and save his own life. He thought wrong. The Orangists were now baying for Johan de Witt's blood, and the easiest way to get at him was through his weaker elder brother, Cornelis. Cornelis was arrested and accused of treason against the state. The charges were fanciful at best, and he repeatedly denied them. This was a problem. Under Roman Dutch law, there could be no conviction without a confession. Cornelis might have been politically weak, but he was physically tough. He was also adamant that he was not a traitor and keen to protect his brother. So they tortured him. And still, that confession did not come. Finally, Cornelis was sentenced to exile from the Dutch Republic. His younger brother was asked to come and collect him. It didn't take long for Johan to arrive at Prisoner's Gate, where Cornelis was being held. It was just a few steps from his house. He was, however, walking into a trap. It seems that the word had got out about Cornelis's lenient sentence, and a mob began to form outside the prison. They wanted death, not exile. They blamed the de Witt brothers for the disastrous war. They wanted the merchant statesman gone and the young William III installed as stadtholder. The Hague militia should have kept order, but they didn't. The militiamen either couldn't hold the crowd back, or they simply let them through. They may have even helped out. In some accounts, the militia shot the de Witts and handed the corpses over to the mob. For journalist and editor Hugh Chisholm, though, the brothers' end is even more horrific. The mob burst into the prison, seized the 2 brothers, and literally tore them to pieces. Their mangled remains were hung up by the feet to a lamppost. Thus perished by the savage act of an infuriated mob, one of the greatest statesmen of his age. Chisholm is mercifully sparing with the details. It seems the mob descended into an orgy of violence. Historian Jonathan Israel believes that bodies were cut down from the lamppost and carried to a public gibbet. Here, their stomachs were opened up and their livers were removed. The mob then roasted these livers on a fire and ate them in front of the lifeless corpses of their former owners. In a frenzy, some began cutting off pieces of the corpses to sell as souvenirs. They cut off fingers and toes, and then cut out their tongues too. Some enterprising individuals decided to castrate the brothers. They did so roughly, tearing great bloody chasms into the groins of the 2 men. Overtaken by mob mentality, someone apparently grabbed a nearby stray cat and broke its neck. Then they actually pushed this still warm feline corpse into the hole where, a few moments earlier, Cornelis de Witt's penis had been. Deban's painting does depict what looks like a dead cat, but he doesn't show us that. This barbarous violence suggests a spontaneous release of animalistic fury. The implication is that the people were so enraged by the de Witt brothers and their 2-decade mismanagement of the country that they mutilated and butchered the corpses before literally eating the organs from their bodies. But it wasn't spontaneous. This was an organised attack. Firstly, the idea that the gates to the Dutch Republic were now open and that de Witt had essentially let the country fall is false. After the catastrophic loss of Groenlo, the French had annihilated the garrison at Tolhos and crossed the Rhine. But the situation had stabilised a little since then. At Groningen, the Dutch defenders had inflicted up to 10,000 casualties on the forces of Münster and Cologne. At Aardenburg in late June, less than 200 Dutch soldiers and between 50 and 165 civilians held off a huge French force and killed around 1,000 men, despite the French cry of, "Forward with courage, kill them to death, death to the Dutch scum." The Dutch casualties, in face of all this fire and brimstone, were only 6 wounded and none killed. Things were not as bad as they had appeared. Instead, the Orangists had seen their chance. Historians believe that William III had no hand in the baying mob, but his supporters, the Orangists Johan and Cornelis Tromp, some of the slain Admiral Martin Tromp, certainly did. This is why no one was ever charged with the murder or appalling desecration of the brothers' corpses. One of the ringleaders, Johan Banghem, was even made public prosecutor and head of police in The Hague as a reward for his actions. But while William III didn't organise the mob, he almost certainly benefited from their bloody reprisal. With little opposition, he took power and reigned as stadtholder for the next 30 years. The Franco-Dutch War raged for another 6 years and involved most of Western Europe by the time it finished. Rather than bring about an end to the Dutch Republic, the war gave William III the chance to prove his might. By the end, the Republic had reclaimed all the lands lost in those first months, and William III was supreme. He also married Mary Stuart, daughter of King James II of England, in 1677, and so, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, he became King of England too. So, things turned out pretty nicely for William III and his Orangists. For the de Witts, the whole situation played out in almost unimaginable horror. In Joachim Olden's play about the murders, entitled The Hague Fratricide, he implores us to, quote, "stand still, forget about these paintings." But he's talking about the portraits of the de Witt brothers in life. No one who sees the painting of the de Witts in the macabre throes of death is going to forget it in a hurry.